Welcome and thanks for listening. Welcome to No More Silos, a podcast on cultural Christianity with me, Erika Santiago. I hope that you will subscribe to this podcast for future episodes. This is episode 1, so welcome and welcome and welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And then if you have questions on anything that I talk about in here, feel free to shoot me an email at podcast@erikasantiago.com. That's podcast@erikasantiago.com. You can also follow me on Instagram at Cultural Christianity, where I'll post pictures of the books that I'm reading and other interesting Christian memes that I think are fun. I like to have fun. So the question then is, I guess, to start as by way of introduction, is why start a podcast? Well, I thought about writing a book, actually, and I started the research on the book about 3, maybe 4 years ago, and I realized I had way too much information gathered for just one book. So that morphed into maybe I should do a podcast. And I kept collecting information and making notes and writing half of a blog post here and half of a podcast post there. And anyway, there were lots of delays and false starts before now. So I just want to encourage you, if you're listening today, if you've started something, even in this time of the pandemic, if you've started something, don't give up. Keep working on your dream or your pet project. A window of opportunity will open up eventually. And the opportunity that I have now is that finally the kids are sort of kind of back in school. And I say sort of kind of because I homeschool 2 of my 4 kids. So that means that I'm busy, but when they are working on their things, I can work on my things, which is very different than the very unstructured pandemic house arrest that we've been on all summer. So now our house arrest has purpose. They are learning. I also have 1 kid in public school and 1 in college, so there's that. But again, virtual learning with the public school works out really great. So there's my window of opportunity, and I am taking it. So again, I want to thank you for joining me today on No More Silos, a podcast about cultural Christianity. Why did I start this podcast? I was thinking about writing a book. I had lots of delays. One of the delays was that I was in school, finishing up a master's in divinity. And that took a while because I was doing it completely online. I was doing it while homeschooling the kids and helping my husband pastor a church. And literally a week after I completed my coursework, because when you're doing something big, you're doing a big project, you tell yourself these great, wonderful lies about how you're going to do all the things you've been putting off as soon as you're done with this really big thing that you're working on. So my really big thing was a master's in divinity. And literally a week after I completed my coursework, everything started shutting down because of the pandemic, and my energy was completely redirected to learning how to produce an online church service from my living room. Now, the plus side is that I have over 25 years of IT experience, so I'm not really afraid of technology, and I dove right in with both feet. And it's still not perfect, but hey, it's all for the glory of God, and I always try to remember why I'm doing things. And so I started a podcast because I wanted to share about share about church and what it is that the kinds of questions that I get asked a lot in the Bible study that I teach. You see, there's a murky waters when it comes to the American Christian experience. And I call that cultural Christianity. And while there are probably 30 or 40 books about culture and Christianity, most of them seem to focus on things like the culture wars or how culture is creeping in on Christianity. I look at it a little bit different. And part of the reason I look at it differently, I think, is because of my lived experience in this country as an African American, as a Black person, as the granddaughter or great-great-granddaughter of people who were enslaved, who were brought here against their will. And so I look at things a little bit differently, and I look at how there are those who believe that Christianity is the white man's religion, and I would beg to differ with that, because now that I've gone through and completed seminary, I can tell you a lot of the church fathers, that are held in high esteem. And forget the fact that Google Images shows you pictures of Santa Claus instead. But Augustine of Hippo and Tertullian and Origen, they are African. So here's the thing, the church has been in Africa since the beginning, and this was not necessarily completely new information to people of color. People of color have always been a part of the Christian story, of Christian history, and that's really why I wanted to talk about cultural Christianity on a podcast. I realized it's a murky, it's hard for folks to kind of see that in the way that the church presents itself in the United States, the way that American Christianity is experienced by many of us. So cultural Christianity, I guess a general definition, so that we can kind of develop a foundation to where our conversation will take us, kind of really started for me with this. My husband shared with me a quote he heard at a conference that he attended last year, and the quote was attributed to Eric Mason, Dr. Eric Mason, author of The Woke Church, and I'll put a link to that in show notes. But it was actually shared by someone else at the conference. And so this, in fact, may not be a quote, but maybe a paraphrase of a quote or a thought. But I wholeheartedly agree with it. And it really is the why behind this podcast and my interest in cultural Christianity, my lived experience as a Black person. And this is what my husband brought back in his journal, in his notes that he heard. And that is, the Black church in America would not exist had the white church been the church in the first place. If Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and others in their time had been able to participate fully in the church, then it would have been unnecessary to develop a parallel but culturally unique church structure and experience for people of African descent in America. Doctrinal differences aside, we have the African Methodist Episcopal Church and we have the Southern Baptist, both groups that are culturally and racially grounded, having developed a faith that responds to a failure of understanding Paul when he said to the church in Galatia, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, etc. This is fundamentally the problem with the church in America. We have historically had the wrong response to the gospel. And I'll say that last part again. We have historically had the wrong response to the gospel. So the overarching question that I have is, why do we continue to allow our cultural and ethnic differences to divide us? And how can we be the change that brings the gospel of Jesus Christ to all the world? What do we need to understand? What are we missing? While I've read several books, as I mentioned, about culture and Christianity, none of them really address the question of how we got here, the historical part of it. And I'm a huge history buff. I can sit and watch history documentaries all day. That's fun for me. And that being said, my children do not let me pick the movie for family movie night for that reason. So I started this podcast because I'm still trying to organize all my thoughts around this topic, having collected enough information and resources over the past few years to write probably 3 books. Because we live our lives in these silos, I use the technology example of silos of data or silos of information in a corporate technology environment. And so I just simply believe that this is not what Jesus meant for us to do as Christians. You may be more familiar with the use of the term silos from an agricultural sense, from a farming sense, where you have silos of grain that are holding all the information, not all the information, holding all the grain, like the corn or the soybeans or whatever that the farmers have harvested. And you keep those, you can't mix them up. So the silos exist just with a single item, single type of item in there. But I don't really think that's what Jesus meant for us to do as Christians. We are supposed to love the Lord, our God, with all our heart, our mind, and our soul. We are supposed to love our neighbors. We are supposed to be living out the gospel. We are supposed to be following the Great Commission and making disciples, which simply means to teach people about Jesus' commands and what he commanded. That's what he told us to do. Now, if you're listening to this and you're not a Christian, that's totally cool. I still encourage you to listen because, like I said, I'm a total history buff. So for the history alone, that might be interesting to you. But maybe you're thinking about becoming a Christian and you wanted some more information. And so I'm really glad that you're still listening to this. But if you are a Christian, then I just want to lay a few few foundational things right out the blocks so that you understand where I'm coming from as a believer in Jesus. I believe that Jesus died and was resurrected for the forgiveness of our sins. I believe that we should be following what Jesus taught us, his commands, and his commands were to love God, love one another, love everybody, which that's pretty much everybody. We're to make disciples, which simply means to teach people about Jesus and to obey Jesus's commands, which, for review, was to love God, love one another, and love everybody. Many of us live our lives in silos, and like I said, silos are a single topic or subject or environment or food storage on a farm or data. So our church friends don't know our family, our work friends don't know we go to church, our gym friends don't know we enjoy binge watching Netflix. You get the point. We compartmentalize our lives. And I really don't think, if you are a believer in Jesus Christ, if you are a follower of Jesus, that is exactly what he meant in the Gospels, in his ministry. It was an all or nothing kind of thing. You're all in. Actually, my husband preached a whole series called All In last year around this time. So the idea behind this podcast is to remove the silos from your theology, from my theology. And all the word theology simply means is study of God. So there's Christian theology, there's Jewish theology, there's Muslim theology. You get the point. The idea is to remove these silos. And by removing these silos, we are able to integrate our way of thinking about God and his presence in our lives. We're able to remove the silos so that we can see historical patterns emerging in our culture that move us away from God instead of pointing us to him. And hopefully, prayerfully, help you to move closer to God by removing the silos of thought that lead to your actions and experience God on a whole new level. When I think of how our culture seems to dictate that heart transformation is make-believe and compartmentalizing our lives should be normal and parents are not responsible for teaching, and we're finding that out to be different right now, and modeling good character for our kids, I sometimes feel discouraged, to be perfectly honest with you. But then I hear about the nuns. Have you heard of the nuns? One of the big research groups recently observed and reported that the demographic group called the nuns, quotes around Nones, are basically people with no religious affiliation, is a group that is growing. And I'm actually encouraged by that. You might be wondering why. Because if someone is confident enough to say out loud in America on the census and check a box identifying themselves honestly, that that's a great starting place for evangelism. It's really hard to invite people to a relationship with God when they think they already have one because they're a cultural Christian. And so that's why no more silos. When we can compartmentalize our lives to the point where we think we can be Christian on Sunday and check the box, and Monday through Saturday we can wild completely out, then are we really following Christ? And so this podcast is kind of based on Ephesians, where Ephesians talks about, Paul writing to the church at Ephesus talks about equipping the disciples, the followers of Jesus, equipping the saints to have conversations with your friends, to have conversations with your family or your coworkers, or even with other believers who may not be as far along in their spiritual journey as you are. If we're supposed to be discipling others, it's kind of like a mentoring relationship. It's really us finding a way to help someone make their next step. Someone may have accepted Jesus, but they haven't been baptized yet. Maybe they've been baptized, but they're not sure about what their next step is after that, about how to follow Jesus's commands in a practical way in our culture, in our society, where they live, meeting them right where they're at. And that's why small groups are so important, because you've got to have people around you who are encouraging you to make good choices, encouraging you to love God and love others, and to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. So equipping you to have conversations with the people who are in your life. And so in later episodes, I'm planning to talk about the history of how we got these silos, to talk about our culture, how our culture has defined and redefined what separation of church and state means. We talked about this actually the other day in Bible study, that you're not allowed to talk about your faith in polite circles. I mean, when did that happen? Why is that a thing? We're not allowed to talk about our faith in our workplace, our school, or certain social settings. So what ends up happening is that we back off. People back off, and we don't share, even though that is exactly what the Gospel according to Matthew records as Jesus's very specific instructions. So why do we think that we get a pass on following Jesus's most specific instructions in situations where we're supposed to be loving everyone? Are we really loving everyone by withholding information that could save them? Anyway, people also back off of conversations about systemic racism for many of the same reasons, but also because we don't know the history or the context of many of the systems that continue to adversely affect people of color in America. We don't know how they were developed. We don't know the backstory. And so we'll talk about that here on No More Silos. So we don't know where to begin to dismantle systemic racism because we don't know how we got to this point, to this place. Our friends and our allies don't know either. I've had a few conversations with allies, and it's new information, genuine new information to them. Just this week, a whole bunch of folks had no idea there were black sororities and fraternities, but they found out, and they looked it up, and news media was doing pieces, stories on it. You'd be surprised what folks don't know because it lies outside of the silo of information that they operate in. So this podcast is a journey, it's a conversation, it's a Bible study, a history lesson. I invite you to join me as and I say we because I am a lifelong learner, and I hope to learn alongside you and as I share what I've learned so far, as we relearn our history and learn what we believe and why we believe it. No More Silos is about removing the barriers to the truth and connecting the dots. We're asking questions to better equip ourselves to live out the gospel in our communities together. So thanks for listening so far. Follow me on Instagram at Cultural Christianity, and don't forget to subscribe wherever you are getting your podcasts so that you won't miss the next episode, which I hope to record sooner than later. Have a blessed day, and thanks for listening. My name's Erika, and this is No More Silos.